Welcome to this symposium. I think one of the objectives is for us to have more collaborative discussions on the learning sciences with our colleagues in NIE and from MOE. I come to think of learning sciences. We have researchers, a small group in LSL and some in CRPP doing work on the learning sciences. I think there are colleagues also in the other AGs, who are doing work on the learning sciences or using work from the learning sciences in their disciplines. In the learning sciences, there's a traditional work on the disciplinary literacies. So you have math education, science education. We do see this kind of work in the learning sciences. So I come to know about Heng, for example. He works in teacher noticing. In the journal Learning Sciences, I will not be surprised to see an article on teacher noticing. So there's a lot of interfaces with other colleagues. I think it's good to have this dialogue to look at the nexus of research and practice. You do work in the learning sciences, so we want to find relevance to practice, relevance to the subject teaching, the disciplinary practices, and also to know the problems in the practice in the field, so that can inform learning sciences research. So you see learning sciences, the presence not just in the OER but elsewhere. Just a few days ago, I think on a Sunday morning, received an email from director asking David Heng and me to provide a report on the state of the learning sciences in NIE, with a view to reporting at NTU level, the relevance for future learning at NTU. So I see learning sciences, because interdisciplinary, it spans across different disciplines and different domains. So I want this to start some conversations on the learning sciences. And then we can also look at, because it's a nexus, we also look at opportunities of how we can work with each other, the challenges, the constraints, how can we appropriate some of these findings? What are the challenges to using this? What are the problems in the field? So we can have those kind of discussions, look at the opportunities and challenges, the practical methodology or otherwise of utilizing research from the learning sciences. So the way we organize this symposium is to have colleagues from the learning sciences to share their work. It could be their past work, emerging work, or it could be the planned future work. The kind of work they want to do, the kind of goals they want to look at, and to present it for 10 to 15 minutes. And then we invite respondents from the AGs to discuss relevance to the teacher education, relevance to the classroom, or relevance to MOE. So, and we arranged 3 of these presentations. 10 minutes, it's not quite a fire hose, but I think we want them to present succinctly the kind of ideas and findings. So we have we arranged 2 of these before the tea break. We have a tea break, and then we have a third one after the tea break. So hopefully you don't disappear after the tea break. So, and then after that, we can have some general discussions, how to move forward. So I'd like to introduce the first speaker. First speaker is Dragan. Dragan works in the field of embodied cognition in mathematics. So, Dragan.
Good morning. Thank you for being here. My name is Dragan Trninic. I recently joined the Learning Sciences Lab earlier this year, and before that I was at UC Berkeley. I have to say I'm still in a bit of a shock. I mean, I'm an American, so I'm in a bit of a shock these days, so bear with me. Because this will be kind of on a short timeline, I'll be reading from some notes just to make sure I'm on track. How can I? All right, so I'll just talk about it, but I can't promise that I'll be on time like this. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about embodied cognition as well as some of my work. So I'll start by saying what embodied cognition is not. So this would be an example of something that's not embodied cognition. In fact, embodied cognition has been promoted and really gained traction as a movement against certain types of ways of viewing the mind. So if you're familiar with the mind as a computer model, the idea is that the brain is, of course, hardware and mind is software. So here this cat, I guess it wants to jump on the table, play with the yarn, something like that. But what's really happening, so say with people, maybe information processing or formal architecture of the mind, what's really happening inside the cat's mind is this sort of amodal process. Embodied cognition is not that. So here's more what embodied cognition is like. Give you a moment to look at it. So we talk about embodied cognition being a sort of simulation. This is essentially what we mean. Now this is a bit of a simplification when I say simulation, but just for the purposes of this talk, we go with this. So here we see a student doing counting with her hands. She says, no, we do our work in our heads. But of course, we're doing in our heads is something very much like it. This is the basic idea behind embodied cognition. And just for the purposes of this talk, I won't be providing a lot of references, or I think any. But if I mention something that you find interesting and you'd like to follow up, please contact me and I'll provide you with references then. So embodied cognition is a relatively recent turn in cognitive sciences, but I wanted to emphasize, just for the sake of this audience, how much of it really comes from, well, a long tradition in history of education. So are any of you familiar with this gentleman? Yeah, so this is John Dewey. There's a number of quotes, so I think for this one, maybe I'll just cheat, because I actually want to read the quotes to you, and I don't have it memorized. So here's what Dewey had to say. Thinking or knowledge getting is far from being the armchair thing it is often supposed to be. He goes on to talk about how our bodies, as well as appliances around us, in the context, shape our mind. Next person, well, you can see from the slide, this is, of course, Jean Piaget. He had quite a bit to say about embodiment. For example, actions such as throwing, rubbing, touching, pushing, these give rise, so the time, to abstraction. Now, of course, if you're familiar with Jean Piaget's stage theory, sensory motor stage is very much what embodied cognition proposes. And finally, since I had Jean Piaget, of course, I have to have, yes, Vygotsky. So this is the one I particularly wanted to read. Even the most abstract thoughts of relations that are difficult to convey in the language of movement, like various mathematical formulas, philosophical maxims, or logical laws, even they are related ultimately to particular residues of former movements now reproduced anew. Right. This is very much embodied cognition, and it was maybe 90 years ago that he said this. So again, the idea is that however abstract thoughts or relations we have, ultimately they are related to, in some sense, residues of former movements reproduced anew. This is this idea of simulation. And if you're familiar with Vygotsky and this idea of internalization, that higher psychological processes initially are internalized, this is, I believe, one way of interpreting it is through embodied cognition. Coincidentally, there's something interesting here. I think, so American pragmatism, which is Dewey, and then of course genetic epistemology, constructivism, Jean Piaget, and Vygotsky, sociocultural perspective. All of these have been, by various scholars, tied with embodied cognition. Now you'll find some scholars who say that embodied cognition refutes one of these and others who use it to support it, so I think that's up in the air. I personally feel like embodied cognition can go well with any of these perspectives. Now what about embodied cognition in mathematics, since ultimately my interest is in math education research. Quite a bit of scholars and quotes I could have pulled up, but Hans Freudenthal, familiar with his work, certainly one of my favorite. He remarked, and I thought this was very good, that learning mathematics is best understood as learning how to swim, and that we should teach mathematics just like swimming. Some people have interpreted this to be metaphorical. I don't think necessarily so. So at this point, just what are some principles of embodiment that could be applied to specifically mathematics education research? Now, I think there's two major implications. Start with one of them, the direct application. So oftentimes, at least in the last few years when I've talked to people, this is what they're interested in. And I think this is the the simplest, most direct application of the theory of embodied cognition to mathematics education research. That we identify physical movements from which targeted cognitive structures emerge. So if you think of something like addition, it's fairly easy to come up with situations in the world where we can point to and say, oh, this is what addition is like. You know, if you imagine an alien comes and they ask you to define addition, you might just take a group of, or you know, a kid might take a group of objects, another group, put them together and say, well, now this is addition. And then there's various finger counting. So we count on, you know, 1, 2, 3, and then 2 more, and now you count all of them together. So we can point to all these actions in the world and say, this is what addition is like. So that would be one example of identifying a physical movement from which targeted cognitive structures may emerge. Now what this is, I think, particularly interested for is for mathematical concepts which don't have direct things in the world that we can so easily point to, something like proportion. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about one specific case of this sort of educational design. This is mathematical imaging trainer for proportion. This is what I worked on doing my dissertation. So it's a few years old now. What you have here is a device that's typically meant to be used by one student at a time. The student is moving her hands up and down, and her hands will correspond to the crosshair that you see on the screen. So the left hand moves onto this crosshair, right hand over here. As she moves her hands up and down, the crosshairs go up and down. They only go up and down. Now the technology behind this, just for the purpose of this talk, isn't so important. I can talk about that later if you like, or refer you to some papers. But what is important is that the child experiences this phenomenologically as if she's directly controlling the crosshairs on the screen. And so, again, the idea is that she moves her right hand, the crosshair moves, so it's sort of a one-to-one correspondence. Now, why pick proportion or sort of why this particular project? Well, we know that proportion is difficult for children. In America, it's introduced grades 4, 5, and 6. And there's plenty of research showing that the switch to proportion, especially from integers, is very difficult for a lot of children. So we thought, how could we help more students make sense of proportion? So one of the things that previous research has identified is that one of the issues with, or if you like, misconceptions, is this notion of same being misapplied. So, of course, if we think of integers, 1 plus 2 equals 1 plus 2. But here, we have 1 on top, 2 on the bottom. And if we add 1 to each one, we get 2 over 3, which is, of course, not the same thing. So if we add 1 to the top, we have to add 2 to the bottom. This is, well, to us, this is obvious, I hope. But we know that to students, this is somewhat counterintuitive because this is a common mistake. Now, there are not a lot of opportunities in everyday life to develop this sort of experience. So we thought, well, why don't we try creating an environment where this happens, where same is in some way incorrect and different is correct. So we created this activity, which is in a way a game. It started with just asking students to make the screen green. What they don't know is that the screen will only be green at certain ratio. So whatever the ratio is set to, in this case, it's set to 1 to 2 from the baseline of this table. In the beginning, students start this game with their hands on the table. So here we have, as long as the right hand is twice as high as the left, we're close enough, we can adjust the tolerance. The screen is green. If it's close enough, it's yellow, and if it's completely off, it's red. And this corresponds to typical traffic lights and other color patterns. Now the ratio here is 1 to 2, but it doesn't have to be. We've used anything anywhere from 1 to 5 or 2 to 3. 1 to 2 is a good starting point, especially for children in grade 4. I'll give you a sense of what this looks like. So this is a student just making sense of finding green. Up. Up. So this is the very first few minutes of child working on this project. So to remind you, one of the things that we were interested in is this notion that same is somehow wrong. And the whole point of this environment is to create an artificial scenario, but a scenario in which this happens. So typically children are asked to find green, and so they're moving and they find green. So once they find green, we say, okay, can you find another one? And what do they all do? Well, they try to keep something the same, right? Because if there's another green, it has to be the same somehow. So vast majority of children will keep the distance between their hands the same and move up or down. Now, this will result in a red screen. Some will keep one of their hands the same and try moving the other one, also red screen, because ultimately the action that the children have to develop for this to work is they have to move their hands proportionally, which is sort of difficult, and we don't really do this in everyday life. I had some practice. So where this starts is that we initially ask them to make the screen green, and then we start asking them questions like, is there any rule that you're following, or if you had to explain this to another child, how would you do it? And sometimes we bring in that other child for them to explain it. So it goes from this sort of qualitative feel to, qualitatively, verbally expressing it. And then at some point we introduce numerals, we introduce a grid to the screen that you might have seen in previous screenshots, and we ask them to talk about it now in a more quantitative way. So I had a slide of Hans Freudenthal before from his work. This is what we call a mathematization. So it starts with the situation in the world, and you start talking about it more and more mathematically. This is that idea of introducing physical action that is ultimately meant to be something that you can point to and say, this is a case of, in this case, a case of proportion. Let me give you a sense of what it looks like when students have been working on this for a bit. So here's a dyad. This is one of those situations where we had one kid explain to another. At this point, there's already a grid on the screen, so just for the interest of time, get a sense of what it looks like when they're talking.
The higher it goes, here, he has to be like in the middle. So the higher he has to be like 2 boxes under. So like the higher it goes, the more space there has to be between each. I think like when I go up to here, he has to be 1. Then when I go up,
like for every box he goes up, I have to go down.
You have to go up half.
Yeah.
Just by the, as an aside, I hope someone will let me know when I have a few minutes left. I don't have a timer here. So in this case, these 2 boys have been working on it for a while, and at this point they're articulating a quantitative strategy. So one is saying, essentially it's the equivalent of, for each 1 box that I go, you go up 2, or for each 2 boxes that you go, I go up 1. So it's a 1-to-2 ratio. So I started by saying there's 2 major implications, and one of them is this direct application, which is we find physical movements, and hopefully from these some sort of targeted cognitive structures, like a sense of proportion can emerge. So this is what I've been showing. This is some of my previous work. But I think one thing I really want to emphasize is that there's another implication of embodied cognition. This can be broadly put as thinking is a much broader cognitive function that depends on the embodied form enacting it. So this is sort of a broad statement, but what it's really about, to me at least, is that embodied cognition is not in any sense a silver bullet. It doesn't provide any direct idea other than perhaps this. I mean, this is nice because it tells us something that we can directly do. But for the most part, we're thinking of embodied cognition. What it does is it tells us that it's not a cure-all. Think about learning. Embodied cognition suggests that learning isn't just this rational, logical process. It's also embodied. It has to do with our environments. It has to do where all these cognitive mechanisms are embedded in. It also has to do with emotions, of course. So what we do know is that we can't just focus on this one perspective, such as, well, human beings are rational, logical. We do know that all these modalities are intertwined, but we don't know how. And I think this is a very interesting time to do this sort of research, because we do know that there's lots that we don't know. We do know that there's many ways in which our bodies influences our thinking, and of course thinking influences how we hold our bodies and so on. our understanding of this, I think, is still quite poor, and I think anybody who's been doing this embodied cognition for a while will agree with that. All right, so just in the last few minutes, I think, I have two things I want to discuss quite briefly. One of them is I've been asked, so what would a, say, math education classroom look like that incorporated principles of embodiment? So previously I've shown you some of this technology. It's meant to be used with one child at a time, right? So it's difficult to imagine that in a classroom. So the question is, I mean, if we had to have embodiment in a math education classroom, how would we pull this off? You know, would the kids be dancing and so on? So I just wanted to give you one classroom that I used to teach. So this is a class I used to teach at UC Berkeley. These are all STEM undergraduate students. And they're all STEM undergraduate students who expressed some interest in being teachers after their graduation. I taught this for the same class for 2 years over there. I'm in the bottom right image there. So this, to me, at least, is a case of a classroom which incorporates principles of embodiment. But you don't see students using a lot of technologies. In fact, most of the time, it's just a blackboard or paper and pencil. Nor are they dancing a lot. So I think, to me at least, embodied cognition is not necessarily something that you build a curriculum around. It's something that can provide insights. So what you can see from these still images is that these students spend a lot of time, well, working with each other, talking to each other, cooperating, collaborating. One thing that I always try to emphasize is students being able to free to move around, that they have space on the blackboard if they need it, but they also have space to sort of get away from it all if they need to. So ultimately, it's not so much about, to me at least, it's not so much about focusing on this particular movement or that. It's about paying attention to how students are reasoning. So in this class, I mean, in a sense, I'm giving you kind of my idea of education here, but it's students are focusing on some particular practice or exercises, and I provide them with feedback and guidance during this. But most of the time, if possible, I stay back and let them figure it out. Now, so the point I really want to emphasize is that it's not so much about coming up with a particular action necessarily, but giving students a space to actually do it. Because from lots of ethnographic work and reports by, say, mathematicians, we know that most mathematicians don't really do all their work by sitting in a chair and just writing on a piece of paper. And oftentimes mathematicians will move. They'll use a blackboard, they'll use gestures, and so on. So to me, embodiment, where it starts, is being able to let students do this if they want to. And just one last point of technology. So this is a local Singaporean art classroom makerspace. Students are creating these art projects which also use a bit of interesting technology. I've been asked about technology and embodiment because my dissertation work was on fairly advanced technologies. And nowadays we have virtual realities, augmented realities, and these are now becoming commercially available products, which means that more and more students will be able to use them, more schools will be able to use them in the future. I think now is a good time to start thinking about how embodiment will influence these, because as Seymour Papert would say, we're getting away from paper and pencil. Math for a long time has been just about paper and pencil, but very soon you can imagine technologies at MIT Media Labs, for example, where you trace certain gestures in the air, and through virtual reality goggles, these gestures become permanent, just like as if we were writing on a piece of paper. Or they might not be permanent over a long period of time. The point is, we'll be able to create learning environments that we've never been able to create before, I think, quite soon. I mean, we can already do this now to an extent. Just maybe one cautionary note is that, of course, embodied cognition doesn't suggest that just more technology is good in and of itself. And I think some of my colleagues will discuss this notion. Ultimately, it's about looking deeper at what the students are doing and finding ways in which physical gestures, if they can support their learning, wherever they are. So I think on that, I'll finish here. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions about anything I said or have any interesting references.
Okay, Very good morning. I'm Heng from MME, and thank you, Dragan, for the very nice talk on embodied cognition. It's something that I had a little bit of experience with because one of my supervisors deal with gesturing. So gesturing in mathematics education, and it's quite nice. And I thought I'd just kind of summarize, what was said just now, the essence of embodied cognition. And in essence, we have this physical world, that we all live in. And we know, as mathematicians, we have the mathematics world. And there's interactions between these two. And very often we say that many problems in real life were solved using mathematics. And sometimes mathematics, can give us insight into how the real world functions. So there's this interaction between the two worlds. Now in the physical world, it's predominantly dominated by actions. We do certain things on stuff. So we have actions. And in the mathematical world, we have concepts, we have ideas, and in the cognitive science, we will say that there's this thing about schema. To understand the concept, we have to have schema. And I guess the essence of embodied cognition is that by performing some actions, we get some form of perception about a particular concept. And in that process, when you perceive it, then you kind of understand something. And being able to display the understanding through some form of actions. And I'm glad you said that it's not a silver bullet. Indeed, embodied cognition is not a silver bullet. There's no silver bullet in education. If there is, then all of us are out of a job. So we make sure there's no silver bullet. But I just want to give a couple of examples. And you mentioned about direct application. Is to identify physical movements which target, say, cognitive structures that may emerge. I just want to highlight one example where these physical movements may not always lead to the targeted cognitive structures. And one of this is what MOE use. There's MOE officials here. Yeah, MOE produces this thing called fraction list. It is a good manipulative. It gets the students to experience what is it like, to think about fractions as part of a whole. And so when students first encounter fractions, they do it in P2, and they start off with this concept of unit fractions. In other words, the numerator is 1. I assume all of you know what's the numerator. All right, so you have the numerator and the denominator, and the numerator is 1. And comparison of the unit fractions is important. And I saw these students playing with this fraction list. So one of the strategy of comparing fractions is to take 2 of the fraction lists, and then you compare which one is bigger. And from there, they get the sense that, when the denominator is bigger, the fraction is actually smaller. Also, I saw this group of students happily doing the comparing, so they enjoyed the whole lesson. It was very engaging. But when it comes to that pen and paper exercise, which is bigger, 1/7 or 1/8? And students have difficulty thinking about, because now they don't have the physical list. So they were thinking, 1/7 or 1/8? And most of them still put 1/8, because in their mind, they can't visualize that 1/7 or 1/8 piece because it's about the same, So this is just one example where, sometimes there's something more. I think there's something more to this. It's not just the actions. You can do the actions. You can use the manipulatives. You can even try to get the students to imagine some form of mental picture that is in their mind that represents the concept, but not necessarily leads to the learning. And I'm also glad that you pointed this as well. This is a very classic example, of the understanding of multiplicative thinking. Very often we do additive thinking. That's what is happening here. And this is a multiplicative thinking. You don't just add the same number. Now you're thinking about multiplicative relationship. And that is very difficult for students. And very often we say there's very few opportunities in real life that kind of influence them, about this multiplicative thinking. But I just want to also point out that sometimes in real life, you have things that hinder the understanding. So for example, this is very commonly used in the test papers. Students score section A, out of 10, 20 marks, they score 10 marks. Section B, out of 30, they score 20. So the whole test is out of 50. And what do? You add 10 to 20 to get 30, and then the total score is 20 plus 30 is 50. So the students have lots of opportunities since they were in kindergarten, when they have to take a test, this is what happened. And so they have this concept that, it's all right to add the numerator with the numerator, the denominator with the denominator, and you get the answer. So you can't blame the students sometimes for making those mistakes because that's what they have met before. And some of these ideas seems to suggest that there's something more to embodied cognition than just the whole process of doing actions and perceiving some concepts out of it. But I must say that embodied cognition does offer a productive perspective on teaching and learning of mathematics. And my academic grandfather, David Thor, has this, he is always interested in thinking of how to map out the entire process of thinking in mathematics. So this is his lifelong work, and it's gone on for quite a while. But basically, you can see the embodiment comes in very strongly in this whole model. It's beyond the scope of this talk to just discuss this, but just to give you an idea that it does provide a productive perspective on teaching and learning of mathematics. So where do we go from here? And I suggest that, at least from a mathematics point of view, we have to understand what doing mathematics is about. And in a nutshell, some of you may disagree with me, but doing mathematics in its core essence is about finding patterns. And not only that, being able to craft beautiful explanations. And that's the whole point of mathematics, trying to see patterns, relationships, and then being able to explain why these relationships were there. And definitely embodiment plays a very important part in this whole aspect. Due to lack of time, I'm not going to let you have a chance to watch this video. This is my favorite video clip. I understand Dragan, from time to time uses the learning of martial arts. Learning of martial arts as a way to talk about embodiment. And I'm sure some of you, how many of you have watched this clip before? No. Okay, so if you are familiar with Karate Kid, right? Jackie Chan is trying to teach Jaden how to fight, kung fu. But all that Jackie Chan asked Jaden to do was to take off the jacket, throw the jacket to the floor, bend down, took the jacket, and hang the jacket on the hanger. And he repeats this thousands of times. And finally, the boy was so frustrated, he said, I don't want to do this anymore, this is stupid, they can beat me up if they want to. And he walked off. And just before he walked off, Jackie Chan called him back. He said, now you come back. So he came back. He said, pick out the jacket. And the boy went down to pick out the jacket. He got kicked by Jackie Chan, And then this is where Jackie suddenly intervened. He took his hand and then showed him that the same action that he did when he picked up the jacket was exactly the action that he's supposed to use to block other people's kick. So the way you put on the jacket is the same as when you are trying to put on a defensive stroke. So suddenly Jaden could see the whole point of putting on the jacket and taking off the jacket and throwing the jacket on the floor and picking up the jacket and hanging the jacket on the hanger. And what I'm trying to say here is that the task design is key. You need to design a task that kind of bring out the embodiment of the concept, but it is not enough. We need to learn how to orchestrate learning. And I think that's where the synergy of all these multiple perspectives of teaching and learning comes in. And once we have this synergy, we can start to think about how we can orchestrate learning, just like the conductor orchestrate the whole symphony. And I'm just going to end quickly by highlighting a few thoughts about orchestrating learning. And what does it entail? And I think on one hand, it entails some action on the teacher part. And I'm going to be very biased here. I'm just going to say that teacher need to notice critical aspects, not only about student connection, but also about content. There's some, in mathematics, why mathematics is quite difficult to learn for some students is because there are specific aspects of the content that may not be intuitive. And so teachers need to notice certain aspects about content, about student cognition, and about their own instructional approach, and how these three things work together to orchestrate learning. But there's also a job on the student's part. Just like the case of Jaden, he could be repeating the actions without understanding what was happening. And so he also need to notice the critical features of the concept. It is where the teacher and the student work together, like engaging in some form of dance, in learning, that suddenly this whole thing, this concept emerged. How to orchestrate that dance is something I think will be interesting for all of us to explore. And in many aspects, when we enter a classroom, it's like taking a snapshot of the classroom, taking a photograph. And we notice certain aspects. Sometimes we notice how the person looks. Whether the person looks confused or engaged. Sometimes we look at what the students do. And sometimes we try to figure out what the students is thinking about. And this whole idea of attending to something and trying to make sense of it is what we call mathematics teacher noticing. And it is a kind of professional vision where teachers see things with a certain lens based on their training. And in a nutshell, there's three processes that are also kind of cognitive in nature, attending to something. There's a shift in attention from something to another thing. And then you interpret the information, and then you respond. You decide to respond. And I was thinking that one way to marry this, embodied cognition together with how we do our classroom, how we orchestrate learning in the classroom is through some what we call productive classroom practices. And one of these, the key one is to design tasks. And we are trying to design tasks that reduce student thinking. Just like the task that Dragan designed, the screen, it reviews the students' thinking because the students realize that it is not about moving in the same amount. It reviews the thinking to both the teacher and the students. And that is, I think, a key in any classroom. The other one, which is harder to do, is what happens during the classroom. That is when the students need to listen and respond to students' thinking. And this requires the teacher to have undivided attention, to focus on the critical aspects of teaching and learning. Last but not least, after you finish the lesson, I think we want the teacher to start reflecting about students' thinking. And this is where you begin to understand the content and see the content from the student's perspective. And this is sometimes very demanding. So some questions for us, and maybe we can discuss this further. How do we design tasks using the ideas of embodied cognition? Can we have some form of design principles that may be useful for teachers to use? Scalability, we have these technologies, now available, and this is, I think, a very exciting time to harness some of the powers of this technology. But the kind of practices that we see in the laboratory, has yet translate itself to the classroom. And so how do we do that? That's a big question, which I believe the ministry is very interested, to find out. Last but not least, something more of a personal interest. Dragan talked about how the actions, can lead to certain concepts in the mind. Now, what about the other way around? What about the actions that the mind, the concepts that we have in the mind, how does it get manifested in the body? And one of the manifestation is the gestures. When the gestures, we say, oh, positively slope, and then you do a certain action, and then when you talk about derivative, we talk about zooming in, then you have some form of action, fractions, or what, there's always gesturing is something that is also fast becoming an area of interest, among mathematics educators, because we do that all the time, and whether that can be harnessed to improve teaching and learning is something for us to think about. Yeah, and with that, thank you.